The night was warm on the Milwaukee lakefront, the kind of July evening that smelled of grilled corn, lake water, and spilled beer. It was the summer of 1972, and Summerfest had pulled tens of thousands of people down to the shore of Lake Michigan. Families spread blankets on the grass. Children rode on their fathers' shoulders. Grandparents settled into folding chairs with paper cups of lemonade. This was a festival for everyone. That was the whole idea. And somewhere near the front of that enormous crowd, a man in an ordinary short-sleeved shirt held something nobody around him noticed: a small notebook and a pen already uncapped. He had not come for the music. He was waiting for one performer. He was waiting, in fact, for one word. When George Carlin finally walked out onto that stage, long hair past his collar, a dark beard, a grin that belonged to a man who had stopped apologizing for himself, the man with the notebook leaned forward and began to write. What happened over the next 20 minutes would follow Carlin for the rest of his life. But no one out there on the grass, not the families, not the sleepy children, not even Carlin himself, knew that a comedy routine was about to end in handcuffs. The question was not whether he would be funny. The question was how far he was willing to go, and who exactly was counting. To understand what was at stake that night, you have to remember what 1972 actually felt like in America. The country was raw. There was a war overseas that no one could agree on, a president who did not trust the press, and a growing sense that the old rules about what could be said out loud were beginning to crack. On television, everything was still polite. The words were clean. The couples slept in separate beds. The networks lived in fear of a single angry letter. And into that careful, buttoned-up world walked a comedian with a routine he called 7 words you can never say on television. It was not a dirty joke. That is what people forget. It was a piece about language itself, about how 7 ordinary arrangements of letters had been handed the power to frighten an entire nation. Carlin would list them, turn them over, play with them like a man holding up strange coins to the light, asking a simple question: why are we so afraid of these? In a comedy club, in the dark, among adults who had paid to be there, it was electric. Think about how strange that fear really was. 7 small words, not ideas, not threats, not lies, just 7 sounds that a mother might use when she burned her hand at the stove, suddenly transformed into something a man could be punished for saying in public. Carlin had noticed this his whole life, the way a child notices the one rule the grown-ups can never quite explain. But Summerfest was not a comedy club. It was a public festival on public land, paid for by the city, open to children of every age. And that single fact, the open field, the families, the children on the grass, was about to turn a comedy routine into a case for the courts. George Carlin had not always been this man. Only a few years earlier, he had been someone else entirely. Short hair, a clean suit, a tidy tie. He had told safe jokes on television, played the nightclubs in Las Vegas, and smiled the practiced smile of a man doing exactly what he was told. And he had hated it. Somewhere in the late 1960s, Carlin looked out at his own audience, the older crowd, the drinks, the polite laughter, and realized he did not recognize himself. The people laughing at his jokes were not the people he wanted laughing. So he did something that terrified his managers and cost him bookings and money. He blew up his own career on purpose. He grew his hair. He grew the beard. He traded the suit for denim, and he began saying, on stage, the things he actually thought. About language, about hypocrisy, about the quiet lies that held polite society together. By that summer of 1972, he was finally free. He had a new album coming, Class Clown, and on it lived that now famous routine. He walked onto the Summerfest stage, not as a rebel looking for a fight, but as a man who had finally, after years of pretending, told the truth, and found that people loved him for it. He believed the words were his to say. He was about to learn that not everyone agreed, and that some of them had badges. The man with the notebook was a Milwaukee police officer, standing there in plain clothes among the families on the grass. He was not, in his own mind, a villain. He was a young man doing a job he had been told to do. Someone, a complaint, a supervisor, the simple arithmetic of children in the audience, had put him there with instructions to listen. And so he listened. He heard the laughter roll across the lakefront. He heard tens of thousands of people enjoying themselves. And he heard the 7 words, one after another, spoken out loud in the open air where anyone might be standing. You can imagine the strange position he was in. All around him people were laughing. Nobody near him seemed offended. There was no riot, no anger, no disturbance of the peace in any way an ordinary person would recognize. There was only a comedian, a microphone, and a growing list on a page. This is the quiet cruelty of moments like these. The law had not been written for a summer night like this one. It was a blunt tool, and someone had decided to use it. The officer kept writing. Each word Carlin said was another line in the notebook, another link in a chain that would end with a decision. Not Carlin's decision, but his. Because before the night was over, this young officer would have to choose whether to walk up and put his hands on the most fearless comedian in America. And the whole thing would happen in front of everyone. On stage, Carlin could not see the notebook. He could only feel the thing every great performer lives for, a crowd that was completely his. The laughter came in waves now, rolling up from the front and breaking somewhere in the back, where the youngest children had already fallen asleep on the blankets. He leaned into the routine. He held each forbidden word up to the light and asked why it had such power over grown adults. Have you ever laughed at something you were not supposed to and felt lighter for it? That was the whole crowd now, thousands of people set free for a few minutes by a man giving them permission. You could hear it in the sound itself, not the sharp, nervous laughter of people worried they might be caught, but the loose, rolling, grateful laughter of people who had stopped being afraid. And the more the crowd laughed, the more certain Carlin became that he was right, that these were only words, that fear was the real obscenity, that nobody on this warm grass was being harmed by a man saying out loud what half of them said at home. But near the front, the officer had closed his notebook. He had enough. The decision had been made somewhere above him, and now it only needed a body to carry it out. He began, slowly, to move toward the edge of the stage. Around him, a few people noticed a shift in the crowd, a man moving with purpose while everyone else stood still. A mother pulled her child a little closer, not knowing why. Carlin finished the bit. The applause was enormous. It rolled over the lakefront like weather. He had no idea it was the last, easy applause he would hear for a long while. Because as he stepped down from the stage, grinning, sweating, alive, a hand closed around his arm. Here is the moment the whole night had been moving toward. A young officer, badge now visible, stood face to face with George Carlin behind the stage. Around them, the noise of the festival went on, the music, the laughter, the ordinary sounds of a summer night, as if nothing at all were happening. The officer told him he was under arrest. Disorderly conduct. The words he had said in front of the children. And now came the choice, not the officer's, but Carlin's. He could have made this ugly. He could have shouted, pulled away, played the martyr for a crowd that would happily have turned on the police for him. Tens of thousands of people were within earshot. A single word from Carlin, and there might have been a scene the newspapers would have loved. But he did not do that. Carlin looked at the young man holding his arm, a man barely doing what he'd been ordered to do, and something in him understood the absurdity of it all better than anyone else on that lakefront. He had spent his whole new life pointing out exactly this, the strange, humorless machinery that treats words like weapons. And now the machine had come for him in person, wearing the face of a nervous young officer on a beautiful night. So Carlin did the only thing that made sense to a man who had built his life on seeing the joke inside the fear. He went quietly. And as they walked him away from the stage, he was, of all things, almost smiling. They took George Carlin away from the lakefront that night in the back of a police wagon. The most fearless comedian in America, the man who had just made tens of thousands of people laugh at their own fears, sat in the dark of that vehicle for saying 7 words out loud. The charge was disorderly conduct. The disorder, apparently, was language. Words spread through the crowd slowly, the way bad news does. A rumor at first, then a certainty. They arrested him. They arrested the comedian. And here's the thing that no one who was there ever quite forgot. The night did not turn into a riot. It turned into something stranger and more powerful. A quiet fell over parts of that crowd, a dawning, uncomfortable understanding. These were not radicals. These were families. Mothers and fathers and grandparents who had come out for a summer festival and had, without meaning to, just witnessed something about their own country. They had watched a man be taken away in handcuffs for talking. Not for hurting anyone, not for touching anyone, for saying words into the warm night air. Somewhere out on that grass, the question Carlin had been asking all along stopped being a comedy bit and became real. Why are we so afraid of these words that we would put a man in a cage over them? Carlin sat in that wagon and, by every account, was not angry. He had, in a way, just been proven right in the most spectacular fashion possible. The joke had come true. The country had made his point for him. The charges against George Carlin did not hold. When the case finally came before a judge, the ruling was almost poetic in its confusion. The language, the court decided, may have been indecent, but Carlin had every right to say it, and no real disturbance had ever taken place. The man had been arrested over a crowd that never rioted for an offense that harmed no one. The case was dismissed. But George Carlin understood something that night on the Milwaukee lakefront that no dismissal could give back or take away. He understood that he had become exactly the man he set out to be. A few years earlier, he had been a comedian in a suit and tie, telling safe jokes to people he did not respect. Now he had been carried off a public stage in handcuffs for a routine about language, and he had never felt more free. The 7 words would go on to define him. That same idea would one day travel all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, in a different case, over a radio broadcast. But in a way, it started here, on a warm July night, in front of families, with a young officer's notebook filling up one word at a time. Carlin never told this story with bitterness. He told it with delight, because to him, the arrest was not the tragedy. The arrest was the punchline. He had said out loud that we hand ordinary words a terrible power, and then a lakefront full of badges had proven it by putting him in a wagon. Years later, people who were there that night as children would remember the corn and the lake and the laughter, and then they would remember the handcuffs. And somewhere in the middle of that memory, they would find the same question the man on stage had asked, the one that still has no good answer. They were only words. So why were we all so afraid?